What if I told you one of the most gifted songwriters of the 1970s wrote the kind of songs that made people pull over their cars and sit in the driveway until the last note faded, and then stepped so far out of the spotlight that the world forgot he ever existed? He wrote on and on. He played on albums that sold tens of millions of copies.
Poor old Jimmy sits alone in the moonlight.
He received an Academy Award nomination for a song you have heard 100 times and cannot name him for. He crashed one of the most beloved comedies of the 1980s, not as a songwriter, not as a producer, as an actor. In a bit part so perfectly observed, it became the single most quoted moment in the film outside of John Belushi himself. His songs are in your memory right now. His name is not. And the strangest part, the part that makes this story different from every other story about the music business eating someone alive, is that he seemed genuinely fine with it. If you haven't done so, like and subscribe. Here is how Stephen Bishop wrote the soundtrack to an entire generation and stayed almost completely invisible while doing it. To understand Stephen Bishop, you have to understand the world he walked into. It was the mid-1970s, and Los Angeles was the center of the musical universe. The Laurel Canyon scene had already burned bright and begun cooling, but what replaced it was something sleeker, more polished, and emotionally more precise. A generation of singer-songwriters and session players who understood craft the way architects understand load-bearing walls. These were not rock stars, they were builders, and the labels needed them even when they did not know how to sell them. Bishop grew up in San Diego, the son of a man who loved music and a kid who absorbed it like weather. By the time he arrived in Los Angeles in the early 1970s, he was carrying a notebook full of songs and almost nothing else. He played his songs for anyone who would sit still long enough to listen. He was, by every outward measure, exactly the kind of talent the city chewed through by the thousands. Gifted, unrepresented, running out of time and money simultaneously. But then Art Garfunkel listened. In 1975, Bishop was offered $10,000 to sign away 100% of his publishing rights for the next 7 years. He was broke. He was close to taking it. The songs he would have surrendered included On and On, It Might Be You, and Save It for a Rainy Day.
Saw his woman kiss another man, so it's telling me it might be you. Can't believe but I know I should. Everybody says
Songs that would eventually generate over $100 million in royalties and accumulate billions of streams across the decades that followed. Garfunkel was preparing to record 2 of Bishop's songs and persuaded Columbia Records to offer a small advance instead. That single conversation, a few minutes, a few words, one person believing in the work enough to say wait, was the difference between obscurity and everything that followed. Columbia signed him. His 1976 debut album Careless landed with exactly the kind of understated impact that would define his entire run. It was not a blockbuster. It did not need to be. Critics noticed the songwriting. Radio picked up the warmth. The people who found it tended to keep it the way people keep things that feel handmade. Then came On and On,
he just keeps on trying.
The single reached the number 11 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1976. It was warm and melodically precise in the way that great soft rock always is. The kind of song that sounds inevitable the first time you hear it, like it had always existed, and someone just had the good sense to write it down. Art Garfunkel recorded it. Glenn Campbell recorded it. It became the kind of song that other artists wanted to own because it made them sound more emotionally honest than they actually were. By the late 1970s, Stephen Bishop was everywhere, or more accurately, his songs were everywhere, and he was not. His second album, Bish, arrived in 1978 and produced Save It for a Rainy Day.
Well, I'd leave in a minute if I only could.
Another quietly precise piece of work that crept into adult contemporary radio and stayed there the way a good coat stays in a closet, always there when you need it, never demanding attention when you don't. He was contributing to sessions. He was writing for film. He was the soft voice in the room that other people built their loudest moments around. You heard him everywhere during those years, on the radio driving home from work, on the record player at someone's party, humming along in the cereal aisle without knowing why the melody was already inside you. You heard him, you just did not know it was him. And the music business, watching all of this quietly and efficiently, had absolutely no idea what to do about it. But here is the turn. The soft rock era was not kind to its craftsmen. The artists who understood melody and lyric the way Bishop did were often precisely the ones the machine could not figure out what to do with. He was too thoughtful for pure AM radio, and not flashy enough for the MTV era that was already gathering on the horizon like weather. And Columbia Records, which had signed him on the strength of his songs, had no clear strategy for what came next, once the songs stopped generating immediate chart results. His third album, Red Cab to Manhattan, arrived in 1980. It was a good record, a genuinely good record, with the kind of careful construction that Bishop brought to everything he touched. The songwriting was precise, the production was warm. It had everything a record needs except the one thing a record cannot manufacture for itself. A label that knows how to sell it. The push never came. The album disappeared into the enormous silence the music business reserves for artists it cannot categorize, and Columbia made the decision that labels always make when they run out of patience. They dropped him. Quietly, without ceremony. Not with a conversation, but with the absence of one. But here is what the label never said out loud. The decision to drop Stephen Bishop in 1980 had absolutely no effect on the songs. The songs did not know they had been dropped. On and On did not need Columbia's marketing infrastructure to stay in the world.
Where it lands on and on, I just keep on.
It was already in the world. It was on compilation albums. It was on adult contemporary radio stations that played it on a rotation that never fully stopped. It was being covered and licensed in ways that generated income entirely independent of whether Bishop had a publicist or a label, or anyone returning his calls. And then came the films. Director John Landis was making Animal House in 1978, the comedy that would become one of the most profitable films in Universal's history, grossing over $140 million against a budget of $3 million. Landis needed music. He needed someone who could deliver something warm and slightly absurd, and genuinely felt on extremely short notice. He called Stephen Bishop. Bishop wrote and performed My Girl for the film. And then, in a casting decision that nobody planned and everybody remembers, Landis put him in front of the camera. Bishop appears in Animal House as a folk singer, strumming peacefully at a party, only to have his guitar destroyed mid-song by John Belushi's Bluto. It is 11 seconds of screen time. The folk singer does not flinch. He does not recoil. He simply watches his guitar die and looks at the camera with an expression of such complete and untroubled resignation that audiences have been quoting the moment ever since. It was not a performance. It was just Stephen Bishop being exactly who he was. The industry took note of almost none of it. Landis noticed. A few critics noticed. But the machinery that turns moments like that into commercial leverage, the machinery that should have been working the phones the morning after Animal House opened, was no longer his machinery to use. Columbia had already moved on, and Stephen Bishop kept writing anyway. But here is the kicker. The 1980s should have been Stephen Bishop's decade. Every piece was in place. The film connections were real. The songwriting reputation was established among the people in the industry who paid attention to such things. The adult contemporary format, the exact lane he had been driving since 1976, was about to become one of the most commercially dominant formats in American radio history. Artists far less gifted than Bishop were about to sell 10 million records in that lane. The conditions were perfect. The infrastructure was gone. He wrote, "It Might Be You." If you do not immediately recognize the title,
It's telling me it might be
you recognize the song. It was the theme from Tootsie, the 1982 Dustin Hoffman film that became one of the highest-grossing comedies ever made. The film earned 10 Academy Award nominations. It grossed over $177 million at the box office against a budget of $21 million. And the theme song, warm, melodically immaculate, built around an emotional question that the film itself never quite resolves, reached number 25 on the Billboard Hot 100 and spent the better part of a year on adult contemporary radio. Stephen Bishop wrote every note of it. Dave Grusin arranged it. Phoebe Snow and Ed Ames recorded versions of it. It was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Original Song. On the night of the ceremony, the song that Bishop wrote sat alongside the biggest films and the biggest composers of that year. The nomination was real. The recognition was real. The room full of people applauding was real. He did not win, but for a moment, one very specific, very public moment, the music business was forced to say his name out loud. And then it stopped. Think about what that actually means. Tootsie was not a small film. It was not a cult film that found its audience slowly over years. It was one of the defining cultural events of 1982. People saw it 3 and 4 times in theaters. It made Dustin Hoffman a different kind of star. It generated the kind of word of mouth that studios spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to manufacture and almost never achieve. And the song that opened and closed that film, the melody that audiences carried out of the theater with them and hummed in the parking lot, was written by a man who no longer had a major label deal. The follow-up album, Sleeping with Girls, arrived in 1984. It came without the film platform, without the Academy Award momentum that could have been leveraged into a genuine commercial breakthrough if anyone had been paying attention, without the marketing support that the Tootsie moment had earned, and that the absence of a label deal made impossible to access. It came and it went. And the window that had opened so briefly with the Oscar nomination closed without making a sound. And just like that, the best commercial opportunity Stephen Bishop would ever have passed without converting into anything the music business could measure. But the songs did not stop. You probably drove to work in 1983 with It Might Be You on the radio. You probably did not change the station. The song has that quality.
I'm feeling it'll just be you all of my.
It does not demand your attention, it simply earns it. The way a well-made thing always earns it eventually. You sang along without thinking about it. You felt something without being able to name what you felt or where it came from. That is what the best soft rock always did. It created emotional weather. You were inside it before you realized it had changed. Stephen Bishop created that weather for an entire decade and collected almost none of the credit that should have traveled with it. He kept showing up for John Landis. He appeared in The Man with Two Brains in 1983. Another cameo, another few seconds of screen time, another moment of perfectly observed absurdity that people who loved that film remember long after they have forgotten the plot. The pattern was consistent. Bishop would walk into a room, deliver exactly what was needed, and then walk back out without anyone building the moment into something larger. He was trusted completely and marketed almost not at all. He toured small venues. He kept recording. He released albums on smaller labels with smaller budgets and smaller distribution and no realistic path to the mainstream that his talent had always deserved. The adult contemporary format that should have been his home kept producing hits for artists who wrote songs that were not as good as his. The radio stations that played It Might Be You on heavy rotation in 1982 played other people's songs in 1985. The machinery moved on. Bishop stayed exactly where he had always been, just outside the frame, doing the work, writing the songs. You probably owned one of those records without knowing it. Someone in your house did. It sat in a stack near the turntable or the stereo, with the smoked glass doors and the brushed aluminum knobs. You knew the songs before you knew the name on the cover, and the name on the cover meant less each year because the label infrastructure that should have been repeating it loudly and consistently had long since redirected its energy towards someone newer and easier to sell. That is all it took. Not scandal, not self-destruction, not bad songs. Just a machine that could not figure out how to package sincerity and eventually stop trying. The songs remained. They always remained. And somewhere in the accounting systems of the publishers and the streaming platforms and the film licensing houses, the money kept flowing back to the man who wrote them. Quietly, consistently, without ceremony. Exactly the way Stephen Bishop had always operated. Exactly the way the music business had always preferred it. There is a version of this story where Stephen Bishop is bitter about all of it, where the dropped contracts and the missed commercial windows and the Academy Award that went to someone else and the decade of adult contemporary radio that played everyone except him add up to a grievance that a person carries for the rest of their life. Where a man who wrote songs that generated over $100 million in royalties and never had a platinum album of his own looks back at the machinery that used him and feels the full weight of what was taken. That is not the version Stephen Bishop lived. He gave interviews over the decades, relaxed, funny, unhurried interviews where he talked about the Animal House cameo with the same easy warmth he brought to the songs. He talked about Art Garfunkel saving his career with genuine gratitude that did not perform itself. He talked about the $10,000 publishing deal he almost signed as a story, with a good ending rather than a wound. He was, by every available measure, a man who understood exactly what he was and had made his peace with the distance between that and what the music business wanted him to be. The songs are still out there. On and On is playing somewhere right now. It might be you will surface in a film or a commercial or a waiting room this week, and someone will feel something move through them and not know why.
I think we're gonna need some time.
The folk singer in Animal House will keep getting his guitar smashed for as long as people keep watching that film. And Stephen Bishop, the man who wrote the songs, played the sessions, took the cameos, and never once seemed to need the spotlight the way the spotlight needed him, will stay right where he always was, just outside the frame, exactly where he chose to be. Next time On and On comes on, and it will come on, it always comes on. Think of a kid from San Diego who nearly gave it all away for $10,000 and a man named Art Garfunkel who told him not to. Think of 11 seconds of screen time and a broken guitar, and an expression of complete, untroubled calm. Think of the songs that outlasted the contracts, the labels, the chart runs, and the award seasons. That was Stephen Bishop. That was always Stephen Bishop. Now you know his name. Hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, and to my subscribers, you already know, you rock.